thank you so much for joining me, and welcome to Botswana Connects.
Thank you very much, Joey. Thank you for inviting us to your show. And I want to say good morning to all our viewers and listeners.
Right. Let's just kick things off here. There's this 5% that has since been affected, right? And the unions are coming around to say, no, look, we want an upward increment. Let's just begin to understand and appreciate, how do we get to 5%?
Hey, thank you. What a wonderful question. This is as a result of an agreement that was reached in 2022. The thing to note is that we had 3 groups of negotiating parties in 2022. So the 5 unions that you are referring to made one group, and then we had another group that comprised of 3 unions, being Tau, Bogo, and Doctors Union, those 3 unions, and then the last group was Manual Workers Union, as we call them. So the 3 teams of negotiators agreed that in 2022 the salary increase would be 5%. And they also agreed that the following year, 2023, to be 5%, and also in 2024. The difference here is that we were getting into what is called a multi-year agreement, meaning that the negotiations outcomes or the settlement agreement for the negotiations was going to be for several years, meaning that we will not go to the table and sit to discuss salaries every year. This is what has happened. Now, for the 5 unions, which formed a group as well, there was a proviso that said, on the final year, which is 2024, the increase will be based on the economic performance. And it was agreed that the parties will jointly do the performance of the economy. They will jointly review the economy. So to jointly review the economy meant that the 2 parties will then sit at the table and discuss the performance of the economy and then agree whether the 5% will be implemented or below or above. And interestingly, the unions reminded us in December and February, when they wrote their proposal to us, they did remind us of that clause that said we need to review the economy together so that we know whether the 5% will go up or down or will be maintained. So it was always the agreement that there was a possibility of the 5% to go down. And there was a possibility for the 5% to go up or to be maintained. Yeah. So that one has always been clear between the parties.
Right. I like that, 2022, 2023, 2024, 5%, 5%. This was like every year there will be an increase of 5%, not a maintenance of a certain 5% that had been increased in 2022.
Yes. As you can see, in 2023, there wasn't a need to go to the table because we had already agreed upfront that the 5% will be implemented. And the thing to note is that that 5% was negotiated because the parties looked at the inflation, and the inflation was about 3.9% and was projected that it will be around that time. I mean, that number. Even now, when the 5% got implemented, we are alive to the fact that it is above inflation.
Right. I want us to go down memory lane here and sort of use a different terminology, lingo, being minimum wage. In 2014, minimum wage averaged 6.28 thebe per hour. And then in 2015, we saw that downfall, it now being 4.86 thebe per hour. And then in 2024, it has been set to be at an ultimate high of 7.34 thebe. What informs all these figures? How does this all work out?
The reason behind the minimum wage, can I say, is its review is based on a number of things. One is based on the performance of the economy. How's the economy doing? And then secondly, on the affordability by employers, or affordability of employers to pay these salaries so that they can remain in business. And then thirdly, the inflation, price growth. How are people managing to sustain themselves in relation to inflation? And then another thing is around the social security nets. They call them ipelegi, where people that are unemployed can participate in the Ipelegi project. So what that means is that there's a team that is actually put together, a whole committee that is put together by the Ministry of Labour that comprises of people from different areas, including Business Botswana and other areas. So after they review the economy, they then decide where the minimum wage should be. And the thing that differentiates all these numbers is that in the employment world, the same way as it is in the public service, there would be people that work Monday to Friday, Monday to Saturday, half day, Monday to Saturday, full day. So it could be 22 hours, 25 hours, 26 hours, and so forth and so on. So then that will determine what someone ultimately gets at the end of the month. So that's where the difference will be. So people that work in a certain area would work 26 hours. Then it will mean their minimum is a little bit higher. For example, those that work 10 hours a day, it'll be different. And those who work 10 hours a day for 5 days a week, 10 hours a day for 6 days a week, stuff like that.
All right.
So that's what it is all about.
Quite a number of factors there that Barela Botswana we need to be appreciative of.
Yes.
Before we start to fully speak our minds. There was the 15% committed overtime allowance for E2 scale. And above, which backdated to April 2023. The adjustment.
Yes.
Yes. Tell us a bit more about that.
It's always interesting that people call it an adjustment.
Please help us understand a bit more.
Okay. In government and in any employment scenario, there are allowances that people earn. Some companies would have a car allowance, overtime, different kinds of allowance, security allowance, different kinds of allowance. So what is different this time around is that according to the Employment Act, the current one, these executives are not supposed to earn overtime. And this has been like that and continues to be like that. In the public service, before the 2010 Public Service Act, public servants, regardless of scale and responsibility, did not earn overtime. That time there was a clause in our employment contract or in the general orders that said all our time belongs to government. Which means you are employed 24/7, so you wouldn't be paid overtime.
Right.
But then after the Employment Act that is currently now being reviewed of 2010, overtime was introduced, meaning that if you are an employee of the government and you worked beyond your normal working hours, which is for most of them 8 hours, you then were entitled to overtime for anything over that. So it has been an issue over the years because some were able to claim overtime, and then in areas where the overtime was excessive, agreements and discussions were held where overtime would then be commuted. Commuted means we will give you a standard amount of 5% of your salary for the time you have worked, whether it's more or less, right? So nurses get that, doctors get that, and quite a number of public servants do get the overtime. Now, to your question, now that I have done the background.
Thank you, Emma.
The executives in the public service were not earning overtime before that, but after 2010, the Public Service Act was very silent, and it still is silent on overtime for executives. And there are those that have worked and continue to work excessive hours. Those people claimed overtime. And there was nothing that we could say, but you can't, because the Public Service Act did not say they can't. So they have been claiming overtime over the last 10 years. And we realized that because If we take that overtime and extrapolate it to all the 1,100 executives in the public servants, the numbers in terms of the time that will be worked, and the numbers in terms of the amount of money that will be paid will become unsustainable. That's why the issue of payment of salaries also is driven by affordability.
Yes.
You will know that because even for non-executives, as a result of the unsustainable hours and time of overtime, sometimes they negotiate to pay overtime half and say go and do the rest, take it as an off. Other areas that feel and know that they don't have the budget will say we will not pay overtime, but we will give you time off.
Time out, yes.
So what has happened then is for the executives, we said this is introducing an inconsistency. We would rather look forward and then look at what the numbers mean and implement an overtime allowance for everybody and commute it at 15%. So I agree that it may look like an adjustment because that has been applied to everybody. It's exactly what we did with the doctors when they were talking to us about the call allowance.
Right. Right. I like the fact that you made mention that 5% and then executives 15%. Why 15% for the executives?
The 15%, remember, is overtime. That overtime is a standard overtime allowance for everybody.
It cuts across board.
Anybody who earns overtime in the public service is commuted at 15%. So it's not for the executives only.
Okay.
And it's not a salary increase.
It's not a salary increment?
No,
we should get that clear.
It's an allowance, yes.
All right. And this is for overtime. I don't know if you can chip in on this one, which is housing allowance. It has been at 300, Pula. And it's been like that for the lack of a better statement, aeons.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What do you have to say about that? What are we looking at? What's going on?
Remember, when we go to the negotiating table, we agree on an agenda of what needs to be negotiated. So when we agree on what needs to be negotiated as parties, they will throw the things that they want to discuss as the unions, and we will also respond and say, this we can afford, this we can't afford. So it just happens not to have been part of the negotiation agenda for 2022. And it's still not part of the negotiation agenda for 2024. There's only one item in the agenda for negotiation with these 5 unions. It's just the salary. And the salary increase of 5% based on only one item, which is the economic review. So we're going to look at the economic review and say, depending on this, what do we do with the salary? So you can see that this proviso had already put a net around what is supposed to be negotiated on or discussed. So if the parties between them see it prudent to negotiate for housing allowance in the next cycle, it'll then be considered.
Right.
Yes.
Interesting. And with the unions, they cited that the 22% adjustment for political leaders is unfair to civil servants. React to that.
Remember that the political leaders are governed by different legal instruments.
Okay.
So when we entered into an agreement with the unions about the 5%, it didn't affect them. They had to do a whole salaries review commission to look at their own salaries. And that commission comprises of people from different areas. And they are the ones that recommended that looking at the 5% and the fact that they were not affected and didn't get anything when the employees in the public service got.
Right.
So that's where it's coming from.
Okay.
It is a result of that salaries review that is as a result of what the law requires for them to be done. So it is not, remember, the political leaders are not a union, they're not unionized.
Yes.
Yes, so they are driven, there are laws that govern how their salaries should be handled.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Last year, Minister Makgeti announced the minimum wage in the public service, see an increase to 2,500, right? And sectoral adjustments were recommended, but the board resolved not to go ahead with this. Why?
Okay, perhaps I may not get into the modalities of why, but what I can say seems to be a good solution that may work, at least for now, until they have another review, is the fact that with the minimum wage that we were just talking about, different sectors work different hours. So the amount of money will never really be the same, right? I think I heard you talk about the 2.6 or something. Did I get you right?
2.5.
The 2.5.
2.5.
Is our side. It doesn't belong to the Labour Department.
Right.
At Labour, they're speaking to the greater economic area, which means public, private sector, SOEs, and so forth and so on. The 2.5 that perhaps you wanted to talk to only applies to the public service. And that was a negotiation with the Manual Workers Union. That's where we agreed that the minimum salary,
for public service.
For public service. And that applies to someone who is at A3. That is our lowest grade. It was 2.5, but with the 5%, it has now gone a little bit higher to about the 2.6 that we're speaking to.
I like that. Just not that I'm just putting my nose where it doesn't quite belong. Why 2.5 and not anything more?
Yes. Remember, it was based on where we were coming from. And the parties, this is a negotiated thing, so it's not us deciding on 2.5. It's the parties that said... I
just need clarity on that.
Yes, it's the two of us. So when the unions suggested the 2.5, and we looked at the factors that affect public service, it was seen as prudent, especially that we knew that with the 5% and other things that will continue to be considered over the years, this amount will increase. Plus, it was also meant to look at other areas such as what the unions were really looking at was, people at this level, don't qualify much for medical aid. That's why even their medical aid contribution was improved from 50% to 80%. So that the government can pay for more. And then other things like, their contributions for pension so that it can be a little bit more. So there were several considerations that the parties looked at. So areba tsholetseng go se ka henyana gore ba tle ba kgone gore se ba se bonang se ba kgontshe dilo tse di kalonyana.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So there's a reconvening that is to happen now.
Yes.
With the participating unions and the like between now and then. What's happening between now and then?
Yes. What has happened is that we went on a recess. And to go on a recess, we agreed between us that we will implement the 5% anyway. And we had sat down as the parties before that at a different meeting where the parties then said to each other, shouldn't you just implement the 5%? And between us, we agreed that, it makes sense for us to implement the 5%. And from the DPSM perspective, we then wrote a letter that regrettably made its way to social media. Ka Setswana gate ha di dile mo botsitseng a di tswele ko ntle.
Ngwana ga tsholela mo bathong.
Ya no ngwana rona ba tsholela mo bathong. Go simolla go buiwa ka yone, o tla utlwa gore ne go buiwa ka yone gongwe le gongwe, mme yanong go sa buiwe ka gore kana bo marra rona le bone ne ba re kwaletse ba rra ba re go kgona gore a ye go godimo kana ye go tlase. Mme yanong kana rona re bo re sa ntshitseo re renya ga gore sepe ha ngwana o la tsholetse mo botsang le rena re ka kera ntsha go a se di kgantse e leng gore ka mokgwa teng ke di dule mme di tswetse kontle ke go di tlhalosa ela rena re ke era dumalana jalo ya re ha re solohetse gore re tla kwala re tlhalosa gore nya mme ka re dumalane ne re implemente response ya tla re nya re boela go tafoleng e be re 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 sonana re itse gore kana mme ne re dumalane ga gona molato ha se sponsor boela ko tafoleng kana ka Setswana go ra ke re yana go ra go tsamaya ka lekwalo le ka gore e ne e bua gore re boela hela ra go diragatsa se se kwadilweng mo closing yearing economic review kana go tlhatlhoba economy ke gone go tla re bolelang gore tla nna bokae re bo re itse gore go ra gore mmele ga ne re dumalane 5% go twa gote a re go tsamaya kgato ka kgato re dumalana gore America kgona 5% tampo re ka se ke re mokgone re bo ra go welalana gore nya me a 5% a tsene re santse re le mo dikganyeng tsa gore bo ra rona bone ba dumela gore ya ka ba re kwaletse re ka mo ketsa gape ra latlhela 10% ga godimo kgang eo e mo botsetsing re mo botlhe ka bobedi re buisantse gore ba ba ka kgonang ba re keng ba ka ske keng ba ka kgona ba union ba re tlhaloseditse gore nna re dumela gore le ka kgona mabaka ke ya le le rona re le ga ka ke ra kgona mabaka ke ya le re na la ha re tla bolelanang teng ka tshwanelo ka gore ra go buisana ke re this is a negotiation. You speak your points, I speak my points, and we finally get to some form of agreement. So this is where we're at.
Right.
And that's what we will do this week.
Right. And this week, when you expect to have this meeting, it's on Wednesday.
It's on Wednesday.
It's on Wednesday. Nya gore re menka se ke go botsa tse dingwe ka gore go go re emele outcome ya bokopano jwa lona.
Yes.
And se leng gore se tla tswala from there. Mama Macholo, ga ke tswa gona le sepe gape se leng gore gongwe o ka batla go se ba pele ga public servants.
Tota nka se ka se ba mpele hela ka gore nna ke ne ke kopa gore re tlhaloganyane ha re leng teng a gona mohiri ope o bidwang gourmente ampo o bidwang mang o e ka reng a bona na le bokgoni a gana hela ka gore o kgatlhiwa ke go gana
Emma
era mabaka a teng re kgona gore re lebelele ko re tswang teng ka nako ya COVID gore go le bokete di economy di tshwere bothata go le bokete tota le one madi re sena one ditemane di sa rekwe ebile di sa rekisiwe mme gourmente a tsamaya go batla madi a gore go na le gore re hukotse kampo re dire sene ka bo re se dirile mpe re oketse ka 5%. Le ha tse ga le ise ka Setswana ke ra ka sekgwa ga le se le recover. The world economies haven't yet recovered, and we can see from what's happening around the globe that the recovery is very slow. So even when government says this, it is because our economy needs to be stimulated by other things, that will make the whole country recover, though slowly. So this is the aim. Ka Setswana le ka Sekgowa le gongwe le gongwe a gona po sa tlhoke madi a go tshela a tlhokwa ke mongwe le mongwe. But there are so many factors that must be looked at so that we don't collapse the little that we have to make it unaffordable and unsustainable.